Today we conclude our September series entitled The Short List. Every September as a church family, we talk about things that are important to us. They could be new things, they could be old things that we are trying to keep in focus or reinforce, but all of them in their own way are essential to what we're about as a church. And if you have listened to the messages this September, I hope you have seen that and felt that. For instance, last week, we had a panel interview with a group of people, a group of neighbors, quote unquote, that we see our church is already really good at caring for and integrating into our church's life. And those would be single moms, divorced women, abused women. And we as a church want to be more and more intentional or purposeful about reaching out to that group of people. And you heard some of how we're going to do that last week. And I hope that in your heart, when you were listening last week, you felt a great resonance with what was being said. And you felt like, yeah, that's true to who we are. And that's really something we can do together. Today we're going to reinforce something that we've talked about quite a lot over the last few years together, but we need to talk about it again because it is just that important. But we're going to do so by talking about a passage of Scripture that we've actually never touched on before, but is very important to me, and I'll get to that at the end. We're going to go to a small group of letters in your New Testament called the pastoral epistles. Epistles is just a fancy word for letters. These have the notoriety of being the great Paul's last letters written. Paul is the guy who wrote most of your New Testament, started most of the churches who received those letters in the New Testament. He's the guy behind a lot of the birth of Christianity. And his last three letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, were written very near to the end of his life. He would die for his faith. He was going to be executed by the Roman Empire sometime in the middle 60s A.D. And he writes these three letters to two young pastors, one named Timothy and one named Titus. And they actually happen to be a set of letters in the New Testament that I personally read pretty often because they are to people like me. I'm a pastor. They're about church stuff. They're great reminders about church stuff. So I always imagine that when I read these letters, and you can have this image in mind today as you listen, that Paul is this older gentleman, balding head, white beard, and there he sits. And I listen to him as my wise older counselor. You have an older friend like that? Maybe a grandmother, a grandparent, an uncle. And man, whenever you were going through something tough, whenever you didn't know how to make heads or tails of something, that's the person that you knew was your safe, wise place to go for counsel and advice. That's how I imagine Paul to be as he puts quill to scroll and writes these letters to these young pastors about this thing that we are trying to do together called church. And in his first letter to a young pastor named Timothy, he writes these opening words. This is the first major paragraph in that letter. And yes, that hole in the middle is intentional because we're going to talk about that verse in a minute. But the first thing you need to see is what's around that hole in the middle. This is the very first thing on St. Paul's mind as he writes to young Timothy, who is pastoring a church in a town called Ephesus in what is today southwest Turkey. Going on apparently in that church are these kinds of things. You had a group of people in this church who were arguing, debating, wrangling about myths and genealogies. And you think, what on earth is that? Well, the next underlined section tells you what that is. These are people who are having arguments about the Bible itself. There were apparently people in this church who were fixated on all the things about the Old Testament, in this case, that you can't understand or that are real mysterious or real hotly debated, and that's where they wanted to spend all their time as a church. And so Paul has to write this opening paragraph to 1 Timothy to help Timothy deal with those people. He goes on to say about this group of people that what they're doing is empty. It is empty talk, by which he means meaningless or vain. There's just no point to it. They talk and talk and talk and talk, and yet there is no action at all. But apparently this is a fairly powerful, influential group of people, strong personalities, vocal personalities, and because this is what they want to have happen, they are bending the entire church to their will. You see that? This is what Paul has to help young Timothy, the Ephesian pastor, deal with. How would you characterize that kind of thing that was going on in this ancient church full of our forefathers in the faith? Well, they were distracted. They were on the surface of things talking about what you would think is worthwhile. So much of the distraction was actually the Bible itself. They were arguing about the Bible. They were debating all the things in the Bible that are hard to interpret or about which Christian people have different understandings. And they thought that this is how they should spend their time together. And in the end, all their Bible talk, in Paul's opinion, was empty. It was meaningless. It didn't lead anywhere. And this church in the town of Ephesus, one of the strongest, largest churches of its day, found out that a few influential vocal people could basically bend the entire church to their will. They were distracted from what really matters most. Which, of course, makes you think to yourself, well, church hasn't changed a whole lot. 2,000 years later, those words, even if maybe we're not arguing about the Old Testament and whatever myths and genealogies mean, we are just as prone to distraction. And those of us who have been around the church block the most probably know that the best. We are prone to distraction too. And oftentimes, if you listen to what we talk about in church, you get that. Because it seems like we're arguing about things in the Bible that don't matter a great deal. We seem to have very strong opinions about things about which we can differ. We seem to have very clear, strong statements about things in the end that are unclear. And it doesn't lead anywhere. You hear people talk about the Bible, they go to 3 Bible studies a week, and yet their life is not changing. They can argue better, they can understand the text better, but it doesn't seem like it impacts them at all. You walk into a Sunday service and you walk out and the Bible has been discussed, but there is no motivation to change. There is no motivation to be different, to somehow align your life with the truth of the scriptures you heard preached. And oftentimes, the culprits in churches are very strong-willed, vocal people who are few in number, but strong and hard to resist. The silent masses want to do something of significance. They want to give their life to something that matters. And a few people can bend or distract an entire church. Ever seen that happen? Somebody somewhere cares about something a great deal. Maybe it's a ministry of theirs. It doesn't even have to be something in the Bible. Maybe it's a ministry of theirs that they themselves care about a ton. And so invariably, you know what they think? If they're not careful, everybody needs to care about this the way I care about it. And at that point, you know what they've become? A very well-meaning distraction. For themselves and for the intent of the church. You see that? This is what Paul is counseling Timothy about. But here is the importance of the passage. So here are the distractions that are underlined. The key question is, what are they being distracted from? If Paul is concerned that their attention is being pulled in directions that it ought not to be, where should it be? And he tells you in that verse that I have intentionally blocked out. He says, look, Ignore all this stuff that's going on around, deal with it, and get people's attention back where it needs to be. And here's the quote. The goal of everything I have taught in my 60-plus years as an apostle, in all the churches that I've planted and I pastored, and yes, the goal of your own instruction there too, should be one thing. In fact, it's one word. Love. The goal of my instruction, St. Paul says, is love. From a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. This is what Paul says we should care about the most. This is the point of it all. That word goal is the word in Greek telos, which means the finish line or the target. The target at which we aim everything we do is love. How do you measure how you're growing as a Christian? For many of us, we've been doing this several decades, if not more. Some of you are newer to it, and it's just as important for you. Over your past years, over your future years, even this very day, how do you measure if you're growing as a Christian in your relationship with God and following Jesus? Paul has a one-word answer for you. Love. Are you growing closer to the goal of love? Are you becoming a more loving person? Imagine that as a church. What's the one measuring stick Paul says we as a church, just like them, ought to have about what we do? Are you becoming more and more loving? Are you becoming more and more able to do that? How do you decide if you're an efficient church? How do you decide if you're a successful church? Paul has a one-word answer for that. Do you see love growing in your midst? This is the only thing that matters, according to Paul. This is the only target worth your life. This is the only target at which we ought to be aimed. And of course, churches, just like people, oftentimes have many other goals than this. Because however noble it is also extremely difficult, right? What you should do is listen to wise old Paul here and realize that really there's only one thing that God is trying to accomplish in you. Over your starts and your stops, over your successes and your failures, over your decades of trying to believe in Jesus, He's trying to make you more loving. The way John will say it in 1 John is that he is trying to make you be able to receive God's love more so that then you can direct that back out of yourself to other people. That's it. And you can talk about growth. I can talk about growth till I'm blue in the face. But if that's not happening, according to Paul here, we're not really growing. Because love in the end is the goal of it all. Here's what's most intriguing about this verse. Paul tells you some very specific things about where love comes from. How you in your life and I in my life will be able to continue to grow in being a loving person, which apparently is God's goal for us all. Do you see it? It's those last phrases in the verse. The goal of everything I've done in your church, the goal of everything we should be about as a church is love from a pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. What does it mean to love from a pure heart? Well, Jesus, in Matthew chapter 23, verses 26 and 27, is oftentimes the human heart, a human being, is like a cup. And on the outside, the cup looks really clean and really nice. And on the inside, in our heart and in our mind, it's a mess. It's dirty and moldy, and we never take the time to clean it out. And perhaps you've seen that oftentimes when we try to love somebody, even in important relationships that we have, it does not come from what Paul would characterize here as a pure heart. It comes from mixed motives. It comes from selfish motives, for instance. A lot of us here, when we try to reach out to the people around us, maybe it's even the people in our home, maybe it's our sons, our daughters, our spouses, the reason we're loving them is to make them happy. We're people pleasers at heart, and we don't want to say or do anything that is going to hurt them or challenge them, even if it would make things better. And while I understand nobody likes to ruffle the peace at home or among friends, love done that way has limitations. And in the end, it can be very selfish because you are not willing to say or do anything that makes somebody upset at you. That's probably love from an impure heart. That's love from a fairly selfish place. You see that? Here's another one. You ever heard your counselor or someone or read a blog online about enabling behavior? Enabling behavior is you as a person caring about somebody so much that you make yourself responsible for their behavior. And you will do anything you can do to stop them from behaving in a self-destructive way. And you place that on your shoulders. That is not love from a pure heart. That is unwise. And it will, in the end, hurt you and them. Love knows its boundaries. Love knows its place. Love knows that you can pour out your grace and compassion and care upon a life, but you cannot make choices for them. And sometimes the people you love the most make choices that hurt you and them. Love from a pure heart does it because it's the right thing to do. No expectations. Love from a pure heart knows I am doing this for the sake of somebody else, not for what I get back from them because I show them affection or I reach out to them. Love from a pure heart isn't even doing it because it's lonely and just wants a friend. Love from a pure heart is convinced that the way the world will become a better place, the way your neighborhood will become a better place, the way your workplace will become a better place, is if somebody says, I will give of myself for the sake of other people, and it's okay if I don't get anything back. If you want to do what Paul's advising here, as a church family or just as a Christian person, you have to be convinced in your heart that loving is the right thing to do. And nothing can dissuade you from that. Not when you love and it seems to fail. Not when you love and it seems to be ignored. Not when you love and feel empty afterward. You love because it's the right, noble, God-like thing to do. Paul says love comes from not just a pure heart, but it comes from a good conscience. Here's what I know about you and I, based upon the words of Paul here, as well as several other places in the New Testament. Every day, our conscience is trying to get us to listen. You know what your conscience is, right? It's that still, quiet whisper inside that crops up oftentimes during your day when you least expect it. We often in the Christian faith associate that with the voice of God's Spirit in our life, and rightly so. Here's what I know your conscience is trying to do every day. It's going to be trying to do it when you leave here today. It is going to be trying to do it in your life when you wake up tomorrow and go about your day, at home, at work, whatever. Your conscience is trying to get you to love. It is trying to provoke and prompt you to reach out in love to the people around you. Not the people you don't know, not the people on the other side of the globe, the people that are already in your life right now, the people you already interact with, the people you see. Your conscience is trying to provoke you to love. Because love comes from a good conscience. The question then becomes, are you listening? Here's the bummer about a conscience. It's the good thing and the bad thing about it. The more you listen to it, the more you can hear it. The less you listen to it, the less you will hear it. Paul uses an expression in one of these pastoral epistles called a seared conscience, which basically means a human being can ignore the impulses of his or her conscience enough that eventually it's like you burn it to a crisp. And there is nothing left of it but carbon. It has no sensation or feeling left, and you will never hear your conscience if it's in that state. So you may think to yourself, wow, I've gone weeks, maybe even months, without sensing inside God's impulse to reach out in love to the people around me. You, my friend, might have a conscience problem. It's not that God's not been saying it, you haven't been listening. And maybe the first thing you need to do is bow your head and bend your knees and say, God, I get it. You want me to love from a conscience, a good conscience, a well-shaped conscience. And I haven't been listening. We may have to do some rehab work here. Will you open my ears and my eyes to what your conscience is trying to say to me all the time? This is the goal of the whole thing. This is the whole enchilada plus the rice and the beans on the side. If we're not loving from a pure heart and a good conscience, it doesn't matter what else we do. How's your conscience? Are you listening? Imagine the exciting adventure of following your conscience to love. You wake up every day and you pray very simply in the morning, God, here's what I want from my day. I want to listen to my conscience when it whispers that it is time to give somebody a caring word. It is time to surprise them with an act of kindness or generosity. They may be strangers to me, but I will be the person this day who brightens their day. I will be the one through whom they sense that the God of all things really does care about little old them. Imagine what it would be like to wake up every day and take that upon your shoulders as your mission in the world. This is what it looks like to love from a good conscience. And last, Paul says, love is always an act of a sincere faith. And this makes perfect sense if you think about what love is and what it asks of us. Love is always an act of faith. Here's the thing. When you choose to invest your time, your energy, your love in somebody else, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And even the people you know the most, even the people you trust the most, you're not real sure how it's going to turn out. You're not real sure they're going to receive it the way you intended it. You're not really sure that you're going to get a kickback from that and that they're going to care for you the way that you are trying to care for them. You don't know. And of course, that uncertainty just ramps up when you're talking about people you don't know well. You have no idea what's going to happen when you write that kind little note to somebody who seems like they need it. Or you offer to pay for somebody's oil change because they can't. You have no idea how it's going to be received. Sometimes it can be received badly. It's rebuffed. They're even offended that you would be kind to them. You see it? Love is always an act of faith. You have no idea how it's going to turn out. But you know what love says? Love says every time I extend myself, every time I take a risk for the sake of somebody else, every time I speak kindness and encouragement to somebody, every time I smile, every time I bring coffee to my coworker, every time I try to sit to them and listen to their stories, every time, I may not see it with my naked eye, but I believe every time, love never goes out without effect. Because I believe in a God who uses gracious, unconditional, courageous love all the time in the lives of people, even if I don't see it. Love is an act of faith. Here are Paul's very famous words that you probably hear more often at weddings than any other place. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 7. Love bears all things, love believes all things, love hopes all things, and love endures all things. Love is an act of belief. I choose to love you because I believe in a God who is love. I choose to love you because I believe that God who is love will use my small acts and words of love in your life to great positive spiritual effect. And I may never see it, but I trust him. And of course, you know what's the most encouraging thing about believing in love as an act of faith? You need to examine the past. You need to take a moment sometime this week and you need to think back over your life and go, okay, where were the times that I chose to act in love towards someone I knew well or didn't know well? And then, maybe not immediately, but eventually, I saw how God used it. There it is. It was not empty, pointless faith. I see it. That God actually used what I did in their life. And you know what that does? It encourages you and uplifts you to do it more and more. This is not blind faith. The more you do it, you will have your backpack full of memories that you can draw from to encourage you to do it going forward. Love is an act of faith. This is what Paul says. What's our church all about? What should any church be about? It should be simply about that. And we should not ever be distracted, no matter what the distraction is, from that, in the great apostle's opinion. The goal of the whole shebang here is love. Love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere, responsive faith. I have a history with this passage. I mentioned that before. When I was in my early 20s, I was just starting my PhD. I had a good friend in Texas where I was in graduate school who thought a lot of me and so gave me a lot of opportunities to go teach and work in big conferences that frankly someone of my age shouldn't. And I went to one that was a really big youth worker and kids conference in Longview, Texas, which is about 2 hours to the east of Dallas. And there we were in First Baptist Church of Longview, Texas, which looks like just every other church in Texas, which is red brick and white columns in the front. And my friend gave me the opportunity to be the keynote speaker there. And I taught about this verse. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. I thought I did a bang-up job because when you're young, you always think you do a bang-up job and you don't know any better. And afterward, I had a older lady, probably in her 60s or 70s, come up to me and say, wow, thank you, Pastor, very much for teaching today. And, I remember we talked about that verse in my women's Bible study. And everything you said today was exactly what our Bible study leader said that day. And you really didn't say anything new, but she said exactly what you said. And at that point, I put on my best pastor face. You know what pastor face is? It's kind of like parent face. When your kid brings home the ashtray from school that doesn't really look like an ashtray, and you don't smoke anyway, you put on parent face. Well, okay, pastor face is sort of the same thing. I put on pastor face. You'll never know, by the way, if I'm putting on pastor face with you. I'm not going to admit that. You put on pastor face, and I'm like, oh, thank you so much, and I appreciate coming up and taking the time to talk to me. But I will admit that some time after, like that day, driving back to Dallas or whatnot, I thought to myself, oh, come on. Here I am, young buck, has a master's degree already in pastoral stuff and biblical stuff, getting a PhD in philosophy and biblical stuff. I assure you, I did a better job at teaching that than your Bible study leader did, lady. I don't look at it the same way anymore. You know how I look at it now? That woman was being taught the same thing that I was trying to teach that day. And it is the same thing that Paul was trying to teach his churches 2,000 years ago. And it's the same thing that Christians all over the globe today gathered like this should be paying attention to if they're on target. And it's a thing that all our forefathers in the faith for 2,000 years have been trying to accomplish. It's the same goal. It's the same target. And now I find it so affirming that this lady in her little church in Tyler, Texas, was being taught exactly what I was trying to communicate to them too. We are voices, all individual voices in the great mass chorus that God is trying to get to sing together. And the one note we are trying to sing together, that he is trying to bring to the surface of human history now for 2,000 years, is one word: love. Love. And if I had the chance to see that old lady today, I'd give her a great big hug and I'd say, that may be one of the greatest compliments you've ever paid me. That your Bible study leader was saying exactly the same thing to you that I'm trying to say. Will you hear Paul's words today? The only goal worth your life, the only goal worth our church, is to love. That's all. Would you take a minute here at the end of the message, and I'm going to give you a moment in the quiet to allow your conscience, God's Spirit, to direct your thoughts into how you personally may need to respond to this. And after a moment or two in the quiet, I will pray for us all.